And to their credit, there are respected Muslim clerics and scholars, not just here in the United States, but around the world, who push back on this twisted interpretation of their faith. They want to make very clear what Islam stands for. And we're joined by some of those leaders today. These religious leaders and scholars preach that Islam calls for peace and for justice and tolerance towards others, that terrorism is prohibited, that the Quran says whoever kills an innocent, it is as if he has killed all mankind. Those are the voices that represent over 1 billion people around the world. But if we are going to effectively isolate terrorists, if we're going to address the challenge of their efforts to recruit our young people, if we're going to lift up the voices of tolerance and pluralism within the Muslim community, then we've got to acknowledge that their job is made harder by a broader narrative that does exist in many Muslim communities around the world that suggests the West is at odds with Islam in some fashion. The reality, which again many Muslim leaders have spoken to, is that there's a strain of thought that doesn't embrace ISIL's tactics, doesn't embrace violence, but does buy into the notion that the Muslim world has suffered historic grievances. Sometimes that's accurate. Does buy into the belief that so many of the ills in the Middle East flow from a history of colonialism or conspiracy. Does buy into the idea that Islam is incompatible with modernity or tolerance, or that it's been polluted by Western values. And so those beliefs exist. In some communities around the world, they are widespread. And so it makes individuals, especially young people who already may be disaffected or alienated, more ripe for radicalization. And so we've got to be able to talk honestly about those issues. We've got to be much more clear about how we're rejecting certain ideas. So just as leaders like myself reject the notion that terrorists like ISIL genuinely represent Islam, Muslim leaders need to do more to discredit the notion that our nations are determined to suppress Islam, that there is an inherent clash in civilizations. Everybody has to speak up very clearly that no matter what the grievance, violence against innocents doesn't defend Islam or Muslims, it damages Islam and Muslims. And when all of us together are doing our part to reject the narratives of violent extremists, when all of us are doing our part to be very clear about the fact that there are certain universal precepts and values that need to be respected in this interconnected world, that's the beginnings of a partnership. As we go forward, we need to find new ways to amplify the voices of peace and tolerance and inclusion. And we especially need to do it online. We also need to lift up the voices of those who know the hypocrisy of groups like ISIL firsthand, including former extremists. Their words speak to us today. And I know in some of the discussions, these voices have been raised. I witnessed horrible crimes committed by ISIS. It's not a revolution or jihad, it's a slaughter. I was shocked by what I did. This isn't what we came for, to kill other Muslims. I'm 28. Is this the only future I'm able to imagine? That's the voice of so many who were temporarily radicalized and then saw the truth. And they've warned other young people not to make the same mistakes as they did. Do not run after illusions. Do not be deceived. Do not give up your life for nothing. We need to lift up those voices. And in all this work, the greatest resource are communities themselves, especially like those young people who are here today. We are joined by talented young men and women who are pioneering new innovations and new social media tools and new ways to reach young people. We're joined by leaders from the private sector, including high-tech companies who want to support your efforts. And I want to challenge all of us to build new partnerships that unleash the talents and creativity of young people, young Muslims, not just to expose the lies of extremists, but to empower youth to service and to lift up people's lives here in America and around the world. And that can be a calling for your generation. So that's the first challenge. We've got to discredit these ideologies. We have to tackle them head on. And we can't shy away from these discussions. And too often, folks are understandably sensitive about addressing some of these root issues. But we have to talk about them honestly and clearly.